In the first video, we talked about Islam's beginnings and we made it to 632 and the death of Muhammad. Let's call that part 1. In this video, we pick up from there with the successors to Muhammad, and we'll call this part 2. When Muhammad died, everyone just knew that someone had to assume control of the religious and political oversight of this new Muslim community, but there was no consensus as to who. Muhammad himself hadn't bothered to suggest a successor, so it fell into two camps. There were those who wanted Abu Bakr, Muhammad's longest companion. They wanted something of a meritocracy. And there were those who wanted Ali, who was a relative of Muhammad. They wanted something like a dynasty. And when it was all over, the community chose Abu Bakr. They held together. Abu Bakr, however, only ruled over this new community as the Caliph for 3 years. And in 634, he died a long, lingering death due to an illness that might have been poisoning. We just don't know that. In 634, Umar assumes control, and he rules for 10 years to 644 before he's killed by a prisoner he had taken in a battle in Persia. And in 644, Uthman assumes control as the third caliph, and he rules until 656 when he's assassinated. And finally, the fourth caliph assumes control, Ali, in 656. But Ali only lasts for about 5.5 years before he's assassinated in 661. And it starts to look like being a caliph is not a long-term job. During that 29 years, from Muhammad's death to the death of Ali, Islam had expanded greatly. At one point it ruled only over Mecca, Medina, but now it ruled over all of Arabia, all of Mesopotamia, eastern Turkey, Syria, the Levant, that's Lebanon and Israel today, northern Egypt, and northern Libya. It had become an empire in its own right. But in 661 it just descended into terrible civil war. On the one hand were those who wanted Hussein, Ali's son, to assume control. They still wanted a dynasty. And on the other hand, there were those who backed Muawiyah. That was Omar's cousin. They were still looking at a meritocracy. And after a very bloody set of battles, Muawiyah assumes control and moves the capital away from Arabia to Damascus, Syria. A new dynasty had been born, named after Umar himself. It's the Umayyad dynasty. And for the next almost 90 years, they ruled just fine. But they had a negative view toward the Persians they had conquered. Persia is today Iran and some neighboring bits of country. And the Persians, they had a pretty negative view toward the Umayyads as well. Part of the divide was the Shiite-Sunni problem. But part of the divide was the Persian-Arab issue. Persians have a long-standing history and a great culture that stretches back a couple of thousand years. They had great art, great architecture, great philosophies, great rulers. Remember Cyrus of Persia, maybe. And they didn't like the idea that some backwoods Arabs, put that in quotes because it's not my view, it was theirs, were ruling over them. So in the 640s, an army swept across the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and invaded Syria. And in the year 751, the Umayyad dynasty came to an end. And with the rule of Asafa, a new dynasty, the Abbasids, had begun. Asafa decided something needs to be done so we just don't have ongoing hostility. So he invites all of the remaining Umayyad family to a reconciliation dinner there in Damascus. And everyone comes and they get them all into the hall and then they lock the doors. And at that moment, a horrible slaughter of the Umayyad family begins. Every last remaining member of the Umayyad family is killed that night, except 2. They were late for dinner. 2 brothers who had come up and as they heard the melee in the palace, turned and fled. And the Abbasids took count and realized they were missing somebody. So they sent out forces to track them down. The very next morning, one of the brothers was killed by the river, but the other one got away. And it's a pursuit that lasts for 5 years and crosses through into the Levant, into what we think of as Israel today, down into Egypt, across North Africa, all the way over to the Maghreb, and then finally, in a last-ditch effort to escape, across into Al-Andalus. At that point, the Abbasids say, fine, you're far enough away, good riddance. We'll come back to his story later on. Let's go back to Baghdad though. Asafa only lasts for about 3 or 4 years before he dies of smallpox and his brother takes over. His brother is Al-Mansur. And Al-Mansur lasts for about 20 years. And during his time he decides he doesn't like ruling out of Syria, out of Damascus, Syria. It's too Arab for him. And so he begins the city in the round, Baghdad, on the edge of the Tigris River. And he moves the capital from Damascus to Baghdad, and it's the beginning of the glory moments of Islam. When he dies, there's a succession real quick of Al-Mahdi al-Hudi, but finally we get to Harun al-Rashid in 786. And Harun al-Rashid is one of the most famous rulers in all of Islam's history. Harun al-Rashid is the star of the 1001 Nights, several of the stories he appears. And most important for our story is the fact that there in Baghdad, he built a library. Well, of course, you want some points. I'll tell you what. Send me the name of the Abbasid ruler who stars in the 1001 Nights. I'll throw in 3 points for you, okay? Alright, go back to watching the video. Library. He took a little small collection of books and made it a big collection of books. And it was known all over the empire. You know, back then, rulers were recognized for being very capable if they had a lot of books. And his son, Al-Ma'mun, he becomes the caliph after him, after having grown up in this library. Al-Ma'mun had essentially read every book that Harun al-Rashid had gathered together and wanted more. So when he assumes control in the early 800s, he launches what's known as the translation movement. He creates an army of scholars to go out to every end of this new Abbasid empire and to find scholarly works. And whatever language they find them in, they're to translate them into Arabic and bring those translations back to the House of Wisdom. And they gathered great thoughts from, about mathematics, about astrology, astronomy, about philosophy, about medicine, all different disciplines. They brought back works from India, from the Asian republics, from Egypt, from the Greeks in Turkey. And they assembled the greatest library known. But he didn't want just a depository of books. He wanted it to be an intellectual center. So Al-Ma'mun invites scholars from all across the empire to come to the House of Wisdom. And there, if you love learning, you could participate in small group discussions and arguments and debates about all of the great things that people think about. And Al-Ma'mun himself liked to sit in on this and participate because he was well read. He said it doesn't matter whether you're a Jew or a Christian or Zoroastrian. If you love learning, come participate with us here. The House of Wisdom is going to hang like a shadow over Al-Andalus so many thousands of miles away. And there'll come a time when Al-Andalus decides that it needs to assume that role for the world. We'll come back to that later.